hello. Um, if everybody could take their seat. On behalf of the Broad Art Center and DMA, I'd like to introduce the person who will introduce our guest, Ido Stern.
Hello. So I'm very excited about today's speaker, Andy Bickelbaum from the Yes Men. We have one Yes Man today. The other Yes Man couldn't make it due to a surfing incident on the East Coast. So we have one Yes Man. I'll read a little bit of an introduction of some projects you might not see today, but just so you associate them, because the Yes Men have done a lot of projects over the years. So here's some blurbs. This is from Booklist. Multinational corporations have many enemies, but few as creative and funny as the Yes Men. In 1993, Mike Bonanno made news by switching the voice boxes of Barbie and G.I. Joe dolls and returning them to store shelves. In 1996, Andy Bickelbaum made a splash by programming kissing swimsuit-clad men into 80,000 copies of an action video game, Simcopter, by the way. When the two met, a collaboration was born. In 1999, they created a website parodying that of the World Trade Organization. Though the WTO denounced the spoof site, and though its creators felt the satire was self-evident, legitimate speaking invitations began arriving by email. Undaunted, the Yes Men donned thrift store suits and went where they'd been asked, posing as WTO spokesmen and making outrageously callous statements. Their audiences were unfazed, prompting the Yes Men to raise the stakes again and again. And another blurb, this is from Mark Derry. Forget the Matrix is Neo, the Yes Men are the one, or rather the ones, ascended masters of media hoaxing, socio-political pranking, and tactical embarrassment. From gwbush.com, their deft evisceration of his illegitimacy's official website, to their helpful rebranding of Dow Chemicals' public image, to their regime change playing cards, which you might have seen, trade you a Dick Cheney ace of spades for a G.W. Bush four of clubs. The Yes Men have earned the ire of big lumbering targets such as the World Trade Organization and George W. Bush. What a wonderful world. What a band of guerrilla media activists does the toothless new media's job for them. Exposing the matrix of corporate power and government venality for all it is. Welcome to the desert of the surreal. So I'd just like to say the Yes Men have been very inspiring for a lot of artists. I think one of their greatest benefits is to provide a model, a really incredible working model for combining elements of art such as spontaneity and sort of radical creativity with really effective political activism, and without falling back on desperation or cynicism, really just keep going at it. And the idea of critical distance through critique really seems to have been bridged with the Yes Men, and very happy to present Andy Bickelbaum.
But you really thought I was representing the Broad Art Center, right? We're in the middle of making a movie, so a lot of what actually everything I'm going to show you tonight is part of that movie, which we're hoping to finish in the next month or two. So I'm going to open it up for questions quite a bit and comments, in part because it's more interesting than listen to somebody drone on for an hour maybe, but also because it could be interesting to me. It will be very interesting to me to hear how you react to stuff and maybe have ideas that we don't have. Yeah, let's see. Any questions? It's so much easier to give a talk when there are questions. Maybe I'll show, to begin with, kind of the thing that started us off on this movie. It was 5 years ago, and we've been doing this for about 10 years. As Ido mentioned, we set up a fake World Trade Organization site in 1999 because we couldn't make it to the Seattle protests, and the WTO reacted to it. It got kind of famous. People started accidentally stumbling on the site because since the WTO reacted, it got into Google search engine, and when people searched WTO, they came upon our site, and we got invited to a bunch of conferences. And we didn't really expect this. It was a surprise, and we didn't know what to expect when we delivered our weird satires. What happened was nobody reacted, and we kept pushing it further and further. And along the way, we kind of branched out from the World Trade Organization to Dow Chemical Corporation. That was our first kind of major departure. Bhopal activists suggested we focus on Dow. It was 2002, and Dow had just purchased Union Carbide, which in 1984 was responsible for the biggest industrial catastrophe in history, the Bhopal catastrophe, where a chemical plant leaked and killed 5,000 people instantly. And the company responsible never adequately compensated the survivors. They received about $500 each and never cleaned up the site, and eventually went bankrupt. And in 2002, Dow purchased what was left of Union Carbide, and there was suddenly hope because there was so much, there was this big multinational wealthy company that could afford easily to do something about this situation. They could easily afford to clean up the site. They could easily afford to compensate survivors. And so why not? Why not try to force them to do this? It would set a big precedent. It would, let me see if I can reduce that buzz. There, sorry. It would set a big precedent, and it would mean that companies would have to think twice. If they could be forced to compensate the survivors and take responsibility for their disaster, companies would have to think twice in the future. And there's a whole there's a whole group of very committed activists in Bhopal who have that as their goal. They're fighting for Dow to actually clean up the site and compensate them, not because they expect it to happen in the near term, and a lot of them are quite old by now, but because they want to set this precedent. And we went and visited them, and it was quite inspiring. In any case, in 2002, we just set up a website that looked like the real Dow Chemical website, and we issued a press release to about 60,000 emails announcing that we couldn't possibly compensate the Bhopalis because they would never be Dow shareholders. And it got a little bit of coverage. One article in the New York Times, which had never covered it before the catastrophe, or never covered an anniversary. And then we kind of forgot about the site. And then 2 years later, 1 week before the 20th anniversary of the catastrophe, we suddenly got an email to the site from the BBC, which was doing a big commemoration. And they wanted a spokesperson from Dow to come on the BBC and speak. And they didn't expect much. Dow never says anything about the catastrophe, but they were very pleasantly surprised when Dow effusively accepted the invitation and told them that there would be a big announcement. And this is what happened. I'll just play the video back to buzzing.
Local people say the contamination has never been properly cleared up.
Should I typically just look right into the camera? Okay.
The factory still exists here, and that's been a real problem for the people living here locally. I mean, with the site, I've been to it, and it's full of toxic waste. People who are living in these houses, they've all got a story to tell about that day 20 years ago. ago. Many of them lost members of their family, and they say that they're continuing to suffer because of the tragedy. And they're saying somebody needs to answer for this. Legally, what they're saying is that they want to pursue the company to try and clean up the site. But whether the company will accept liability seems doubtful.
Navdeep Dharawal, BBC News, Bhopal.
Well, joining us live from Paris now is Jude Finisterra. He's a spokesman for Dow Chemicals, which took over Union Carbide. Good morning to you. A day of commemoration in Bhopal. Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
Steve, yes. Today is a great day for all of us at Dow, and I think for millions of people around the world as well. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site. Now, when we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and it's worth $12 billion. $12 billion. We have resolved to liquidate Union Carbide, this nightmare for the world and this headache for Dow, and use the $12 billion to adequately compensate the victims.
Jude, that's good news that you have finally accepted responsibility. Some people would say too late. It's 3 years,
Yes.
almost 4 years on.
When we acquired Union Carbide, we did settle their liabilities in the United States immediately. And we are now, 3 years later, prepared to do the same in India. We should have done it 3 years ago. We are doing it now. And I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do. And our shareholders may take a bit of a hit, Steve, but I think that if they're anything like me, they will be ecstatic to be part of such a historic occasion of doing right by those that we've wronged.
Just to reiterate what Jude Finisterra, the spokesman for Dow Chemicals, has just said, he says Dow Chemicals now fully accept responsibility for the events in Bhopal 20 years ago.
Great. That's it?
Well done.
Great. Now they want
Now you do
radio. I can tell you one thing. We're not going out of business. We will continue to make profit. We will simply make slightly less profit than normal. But we are doing the right thing. We're comparing here, though, the value of money to the value of human life, and there is no comparison.
It's a good thing to know. For once, it's good news.
Exactly. I mean, how often does Dow get to, you know? It wouldn't be, I wouldn't want to be a Dow spokesperson otherwise, really. So, thanks. Yeah, so a couple things happened, as you might have immediately. I almost had a nervous breakdown, of course, and went home and soon got a phone call from the BBC saying that they had contacted Union Carbide, and they said there was nobody by the name of Jude Finisterra, my name on the TV thing. And I tried to say, well, you know, Dow bought Union Carbide, so of course they wouldn't want to, they wouldn't admit that they had disappeared. And that they should try to contact Dow instead of Union Carbide. I didn't even know that Union Carbide existed or had offices. But of course they didn't believe that, and an hour later it was announced that they had been hoaxed. And another thing that happened that we found out a little later in the day was that the Dow share price actually plunged by about $3 billion in response to the announcement. And then, unfortunately, as soon as it was revealed to be a hoax, it went right back up, and I think closed up for the day, which, you know, if you think about it, that's kind of scary, and might have an answer there as to why companies like Dow don't do the simple, obvious, right thing, They could just make an executive decision and decide to clean up the site of the catastrophe and compensate the survivors, but if they did, their share price would fall, and who knows how far it would go. So, so those are two things that happened. Any questions so far? Yeah? No. We've never faced any real legal action. I think companies like Dow just guess that we would be able to use that to our advantage. It would be more publicity. Also, it's a gray zone of the law. It's unclear what the legalities of it are. We were apparently being investigated by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, after this because the Dow share price plunged. And apparently the SEC was looking into whether we had done that on purpose and had shorted the stock and made a killing off it, but we hadn't guessed that would happen. So, fortunately, so we didn't.
I was going to ask, do you take precautions against making sure that you don't have any sort of mutual funds are invested in the companies you're hoaxing, just in case?
No.
Okay.
We. Yeah. Well, yeah, well, we do things different ways. With this, we just had this website up there, and it got this invitation. As we went along, well, that actually a month after this, we got another invitation the same way in London, of all places. This was on the BBC, and it was all over the British media, everywhere. And, Channel 4 had a field day, and they all did. And then a month later, we got an invitation from a banking conference in London to that website. And it was kind of it felt quite surprising. After that, we stopped having the patience to wait for things because a few months went by, and we decided we wanted to start focusing on global warming as a subject. And we wanted to impersonate Halliburton and go to a conference as Halliburton. I don't know the order in which we decided these things, but we stopped waiting for people to stumble on our websites, and we got into being con men more and posing. It's quite simple. You just pose as a public relations company, say that your client wants to go to the conference and must have a presence at the conference, and the conference organizers are kind of running a scam as well. They're doing these ridiculous conferences, and they're happy to have somebody high profile. So you promise them somebody high profile at the last minute, they get switched and so on. Can go into more detail on that if anybody wants to know how to do it. It's not rocket science. Yeah.
Sorry, before you speak, we're actually streaming this presentation, so if you can use the microphone and then pass it around when you have questions, so that the online audience get to hear the question as well as the answer.
Ooh, there's an online audience.
Yes, there is.
Wow. Hello.
Just to the next person.
Did Dow ever have to come out with a statement after your intervention saying that we know we are actually not compensating these people, we are not actually making reparations?
Yeah, they did. Here it is. It's a bit disappointing. What Dow should be doing.
This morning, a false statement was carried by BBC World regarding responsibility for the Bhopal tragedy. The individual who made this statement identified himself as a Dow spokesperson named Jude Finestra. Dow confirms that there was no basis whatsoever for this report.
Yeah, that's it. It wasn't very satisfying. So we actually issued a press release on behalf of Dow, sent it to 60,000 journalists, saying what scoundrels we were, and included a list of all the things we were not doing.